I know a lot of you are interested in learning a foreign language. Well, Rocket Languages allows you to do it quickly at your own pace and while on the go. Get a free trial version with over 4 hours of free lessons and other free content when you go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket.
Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. John Feffer about the North Korean nuclear program, the current situation in North Korea, and tensions between the United States and North Korea. John is the director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. He is the author of several books, with his most recent one being the dystopian novel Splinterlands. His other books include North Korea, South Korea, U.S. Policy at a Time of Crisis, and Crusade 2.0, The West's Resurgent War on Islam. You can follow his work via his website at johnfeffer.com, that's John with an H, and Feffer.com, and at Foreign Policy and Focus's website at fpif.org. You can find him on Twitter at John Feffer, and for more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/North-Korea. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, I know we could do a whole episode with this first question, but briefly for us, give us a brief overview of kind of the tensions in the Korean Peninsula and how the Korean War fits into the tensions.
Okay, yeah, that's a big question. So, as I'm sure your listeners know, the Korean Peninsula is divided, has been divided since the end of World War II between North and South. The North aligned with the Soviet Union initially, and the South aligned with the United States. There were quite a few border skirmishes between the two Koreas between 1945 and 1950. North Korea invades the South in 1950 with the hopes of unifying the peninsula, fails to do so. The United States intervenes under the UN flag, and without going into a lot of detail, there's a basically stalemate after 3 years. The war ends in an armistice. So in fact, it doesn't end in a peace treaty. And the peninsula continues to be divided pretty much where it was divided in 1945. North Korea has gradually, I would say over the last 30 to 40 years, lost its edge in relationship to South Korea. In other words, they were roughly on par economically, militarily through the 1960s into the 1970s. But as a result of South Korea's extraordinary economic growth beginning in the 1970s, and North Korea's stagnation economically, the two Koreas have diverged dramatically economically. And then, of course, with South Korea becoming a democracy in the late 1980s, they've diverged politically as well. In order to effectively catch up, at least on the military side, North Korea has invested a lot of time and money in a nuclear program, both to acquire nuclear energy to compensate for the more expensive energy coming from China and Russia when those two countries went to hard currency for trading purposes. But as importantly, to prevent any country from thinking of invading North Korea or attacking North Korea. North Korea, of course, has looked around at other countries in the world, has seen that countries that give up their nuclear programs, sometimes, not always, but sometimes then experience a kind of regime change, as Iraq and Libya have done, which has only reinforced North Korea's determination to become a nuclear power and prevent that from happening to it. More recently, North Korea this September tested for the sixth time its nuclear weapon, and it has continued to test long-range missiles. The testing of those long-range missiles has particularly irked the United States because, of course, the Trump administration now finds itself with this problem on its hands, and North Korea with the capability, perhaps, although it's not definite, of attacking the United States with nuclear weapons. So that's the conflict as it stands right now, and its kind of origins in the division of the peninsula and the Korean War.
Yeah, and can we take a closer look at the military outlook for South Korea and North Korea here? So obviously, you talked about North Korea's nuclear program there, and a lot of people have some familiarity with the fact that North Korea has a nuclear program, but there's a lot of speculation about just what it consists of and what sorts of weapons they have. So can you touch on that a little bit more, as well as what South Korea's military capabilities are?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to clear up anything for you because North Korea's nuclear program is veiled in a shroud of uncertainty. As I said, it's tested nuclear bombs of some sort, 6 times. The yields have gone up. Obviously, they're learning something from these tests. There have been photographs that outsiders have interpreted as the miniaturization of their nuclear capability. In other words, yeah, they obviously have something they can explode, but the question always was, can they turn that into a warhead, which requires what's known as miniaturization technology. It's not definite that they have that. I mean, what is seen in the photograph could, of course, just be an empty shell, but certainly North Korea would like us to believe that it has a robust nuclear program, because obviously if it announced that it has a lousy nuclear program, then no one would take it seriously, and the whole deterrent effect of that program would be lost. So as for its long-range missiles, well, clearly it has missiles. The range of those missiles, again, that's tough to evaluate. The latest tests, the missiles have certainly gone up high enough and therefore down far enough to suggest that if they were to go on a horizontal trajectory, they could reach U.S. homeland. But there's no, definite evaluation that North Korea could actually target the United States. In other words, make a missile go in a trajectory to strike where it wants to strike somewhere within the United States. So that's North Korea. South Korea, of course, no longer has nuclear weapons. I mean, it had, for a period of time, some U.S. Nuclear weapons were based on its soil, but those were removed. There are some conservative voices in South Korea that are urging South Korea to reconsider that, to once again acquire not only nuclear weapons from the United States, but perhaps even its own nuclear capability. The current president, Moon Jae-In, has said, no, that's not a good idea. And, in terms of its conventional capabilities, well, South Korea has a tremendous amount of firepower by any standard. And then if you add on to that what the United States also provides, then it's both the United States and South Korea combined would completely overwhelm North Korea. There is, of course, one caveat to that, and that is that North Korea does field a considerable number of artillery along the border, just north of the DMZ, which puts it within about 50 or so miles from Seoul. In other words, not that far from the bulk of the population of South Korea, upwards of 25 million people, or roughly half in the Seoul metropolitan area. In other words, North Korea, with relatively unsophisticated conventional weaponry, artillery, can threaten a huge number of South Korean citizens. So even if a war were to break out and it didn't escalate to nuclear level, even if it didn't escalate to medium-range missile level, it could be extraordinarily devastating for the South as well as the North.
So lately we've seen more, hawkish rhetoric, I would say, from both sides. Why has the rhetoric stepped up so much so fast?
Well, that's an easy one to answer. The reason is obvious. It's Donald Trump's mouth. Because, frankly, North Korea has always been intemperate when it comes to rhetoric. I mean, you could go back 20, 30 years, and North Korea has accused, leaders of the United States, leaders of South Korea, leaders of Japan, as being, horrible people. Dotards, of course, would be the least damaging thing that North Korea has said about somebody. And has threatened to turn Seoul into a sea of fire, threatened to destroy Japan, threatened to annihilate the United States, yada, yada, yada. that's kind of, the standard operating procedure coming out of Pyongyang. The response generally has been, whether we're talking Japan or South Korea, but particularly the United States, has been, well, thank you for your comments. We are not happy with what you've said. We have a lot of military weapons. And we caution you to behave responsibly, or something along those lines. In other words, the response from all the other countries that North Korea has threatened has been pretty much blasé. I mean, it's been, couched in relatively anodyne diplomatic language. Donald Trump, of course, doesn't know what that means. Donald Trump has never spoken that way to anybody, probably not even to his wife. And so with this situation coming up with Kim Jong-Un, he takes it very personally. He has treated Kim Jong-Un the same way that he's treated, Ted Cruz, Hillary Clinton, anybody that he perceives as an adversary. He tries to diminish and insult and use the most aggressive language possible. The problem, of course, is that he's in a different arena here. He is in a situation in which rhetoric can be misinterpreted and it can be seen as a kind of signal for an escalation and a movement away from rhetoric into actual action. So that's the real difference here. And I think people are accustomed to what North Korea has said and not accustomed to what the United States is now saying through the mouth of Donald Trump.
Well, in moving beyond Donald Trump, we've seen Nikki Haley, his UN ambassador, with some very hawkish rhetoric, and then we've seen Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State trying to work back-channel negotiations with North Korea, and Trump recently, just within the last few days, telling him not to waste his time with that. But can you talk about the Trump administration beyond just Donald Trump, as well as the new South Korean president, Moon Jae-In, what he has had to say about the North Korea issue and how he has differed so far from his predecessors?
Mm-hmm. Well, in general, with the exception of Nikki Haley, the Trump administration has been rather cautious when talking about North Korea. Now, of course, folks will say, as they've said in previous administrations, that, quote unquote, all options are on the table, which presumably means a nuclear strike as well. But Nikki Haley, perhaps channeling her predecessor, John Bolton, has gone a little further in articulating, say, the harshest neocon hawk position toward North Korea. But if we look at even the dearly departed Steve Bannon, who, when he was interviewed, I think it was last interview, in fact, on North Korea, among other issues, he basically said, look, the military option is not on the table. We don't have that option with North Korea. It's ridiculous to even consider that. They have us hostage because of what they can do to Seoul, primarily. So let's just get real and focus on the real threat. And for Steve Bannon, the real threat was China. The other members of the administration, McMaster or Mattis, head of the Pentagon, generally speaking, they have been more cautious. Again, they say all options are on the table, but they have stressed, and I think rightly so, that the military option would exact an enormous cost. And so they're reluctant to even consider that. And I think that has generally been the Pentagon's perspective, or the national security perspective, going back several administrations. Donald Trump, again, is in a category by himself, with maybe Nikki Haley part of the time in that same category. But really, Donald Trump is not thinking geostrategically here. This is more of a mano-a-mano thing with Donald Trump. Or if one wants to even go so far as to assume that he's making calculations, the calculations he's making are rather vulgar ones about what he can say aggressively that would make maybe at some point negotiations more likely, because he's playing the bad cop and Rex Tillerson is playing the good cop. But we may be giving, if we take that kind of perspective, we might be giving Donald Trump more credit than he's really due. So that's the administration and its various voices. In South Korea, well, South Korea has been, under threat, shall we say, of North Korea for many decades. I think Moon Jae-In coming in as a progressive, hoping to restart negotiations with North Korea at the economic level. It's been a major disappointment to see the deterioration of relations between the United States and North Korea, as well as North Korea and pretty much all of its neighbors. Moon Jae-In has tried to keep the diplomatic option available, but he's in a difficult position because, of course, he also wants to ensure that the U.S. alliance with South Korea prospers. And so to do that, he really has to kind of toe the line as an ally. I think, what he would like to see is a gradual kind of reduction in tensions and an opportunity for South Korea to play a real role here, rather than simply kind of running around trying to put out fires.
For all of you out there who are interested in learning a foreign language, check out Rocket Languages at wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Rocket Languages makes it easier for you to learn a foreign language at your own pace and in a quick and efficient manner. Their courses allow you to learn on the go and make sure that you retain what you're learning. They'll explain everything from grammar and mechanics to culture to how to incorporate what you're learning into everyday conversations. And the courses for all 13 languages they offer include lifetime online access to teachers and native speakers every second of the day. To get your free trial and mini course, check out wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/rocket.
What in the past has worked with negotiating with North Korea, and what in the past has not worked?
Well, I'm assuming you mean at the national security level, because, of course, negotiating with North Korea takes place at a variety of different levels. There are lots of economic actors that have interacted with North Korea over many decades, including, pretty prominent capitalist transnational corporations. A number of NGOs work with North Korea and therefore have to establish memorandum of understanding, and therefore they negotiate all the time. And some organizations have been there for decades doing humanitarian work of one sort or the other. The UN, of course, negotiates with North Korea. So there's a range of negotiations that are very functional and that have sometimes not worked. I mean, certainly some companies have pulled out of North Korea, disappointed or feeling that North Korea didn't abide by their side of the contract. But basically, there have been a range of successful negotiations. National security, well, that's tougher because we're talking about North Korea's nuclear program. And as I said, North Korea sees this as a kind of necessary deterrent. So if this is the only thing that North Korea has that can deter the United States from attacking, it's going to be very reluctant to give it up. Nevertheless, we did see two occasions when North Korea sat down with the Clinton administration in 1994 and then with the Bush administration in 2006, where they made some pretty substantial agreements on freezing, in the first case, their nuclear program under the agreed framework, which lasted for about 6 years. And then during the six-party talks under the George W. Bush administration, not only freezing its program, but actually starting to dismantle parts of it. Now, of course, North Korea and the United States both violated the terms of their agreement, certainly in spirit, if not in specific detail. And that is certainly grist for a longer discussion if you're interested. But to my mind, it suggests that North Korea is within the bounds of negotiations. In other words, we're not talking about a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or the Islamic State, which fundamentally rejects the notion of negotiations because it sees the rest of the world as being barbaric and really either to be destroyed or to be held at arm's length. North Korea aspires to be part of the international community. It wants to be recognized as a nuclear state, but as a normal state in general, wants to be part of the global economy, and therefore it is within the bounds of negotiations. How we do those negotiations? Well, North Koreans are tough negotiators. No one ever said it was going to be easy. But we have some examples of where it's been successful in the past, and it would be useful for the State Department, for Rex Tillerson, to continue to pursue the very negotiations that his boss, Donald Trump, has said are not worth pursuing.
So what might successful future negotiations look like? Would the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises be a part of this? What would Kim Jong-Un want? What could the U.S. get out of it? What might successful negotiations in the short term, in the near future, look like?
Well, in the very short term, successful negotiations would be folks just sitting down and talking. I mean, at this point, because of the poisoned atmosphere between the United States and North Korea, any kind of actual face-to-face discussions, I think, would send a very strong signal that both parties are willing to step away from the precipice. So that's the first thing. I don't care what they talk about. They could talk about the weather. They could talk about, your podcast. I don't really care what they talk about as long as they sit down and send the signal that talking is possible. Now, if we move a little further, what might medium-term negotiation success look like? Well, first, we would be looking at not eliminating North Korea's nuclear program, because North Korea has already said that's off the table, but freezing it at the state that it's currently in. Maybe we could throw in a freeze on North Korea's missile launches as well. And North Korea has actually done rather long-term moratorium on its missile launches in the past, for as long as 6 or 7 years, during the 1990s into the 2000s. On the U.S. side, what would the United States be willing to offer? Well, certainly North Korea would be looking for some sanctions relief, and they have themselves admitted that the sanctions have exacted a pretty heavy toll on their economy. But of course, they're also looking for some kind of security guarantee. And while the United States promising not to attack Pyongyang is probably not going to be a sufficient guarantee for North Korea, some concrete sign like maybe either the suspension or at least the scaling back of U.S.-South Korean military exercises, as well as perhaps a pledge by the United States not to send its surveillance planes so close to North Korean territory.
At the beginning of that answer, you jokingly said that they could talk about the weather, but another thing they could talk about is basketball, since Dennis Rodman seems to be the one person that has relationships with both Kim Jong-Un and Donald Trump. What do you make of the whole bizarre situation with retired basketball player Dennis Rodman and his connections to North Korea?
Yeah, well, I mean, ordinarily, if we were in a normal situation, Dennis Rodman's trips to North Korea would not really mean anything. But because the Obama administration pursued a policy of strategic patience, in other words, attempting to ignore North Korea as much as possible, and Donald Trump has pursued a policy of rather aggressive patience, if you will, then any kind of contact with Kim Jong-Un rises to the level of important. And so Dennis Rodman, even if he is not perhaps anyone's first choice as a diplomat at large, represents, hey, an American who can sit down and talk with Kim Jong-un at a very human level. If Dennis Rodman can do it, why can't Rex Tillerson or one of Rex Tillerson's minions? If it's basketball that North Korea is interested in, well, certainly sports diplomacy has played an important role in reducing tensions between hostile countries in the past. Probably it's not going to be basketball that is what we would be kind of the corollary of ping pong diplomacy from U.S.-China relations of the 1970s, simply because the United States is frankly so much better at basketball than North Korea. It would probably be better to look at a sport where North Korea is more equal in its abilities, and perhaps even better, whether we're talking wrestling or we're talking taekwondo, or even track and field, where we've had several North Koreans excel at the Olympics.
North Korea has a history of violating agreements that they've gotten into. So what do you think you would say to people who say, oh, well, they can't hold their end of the agreement, so why even bother? And on top of that, too, what role do you think China, Russia, Japan, and other nations might have in negotiating with North Korea?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's often a matter of interpretation, the degree to which one side or the other violates the spirit or the letter of an agreement. And sometimes you have arms control agreements, for instance, between the United States and Russia, in which there have been violations, but the agreements themselves have held in large part and have made a difference. So we can certainly imagine a situation in which both sides are trading accusations. For instance, in the current nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran, Iran would like to see the United States lift more sanctions. The United States would like to see some elements of Iran's conduct, let's say its missile tests, be included more specifically in the nuclear agreement. In other words, both sides have some accusations and some, and we could talk about whether they're worthwhile or not, but at least from the perception of both sides, the agreement is being violated in some part by both sides, and yet the agreement still holds between the United States and Iran, and still it proves an extremely valuable agreement. One can imagine the same thing with the United States and North Korea. Also, it's every agreement leaves behind some residue of success, if you will. A group of people who have been involved in the negotiations, who have experience, understanding, and when the next round comes round, they're not always starting at level zero. That's certainly the case with North Korea. The United States is a little different, especially when Trump comes in and fires everybody or doesn't replace anybody in the State Department, but that's another issue. Then there is a certain amount of trust that's built up during negotiations. Yes, okay, when violations occur, that trust takes a hit, but still, there's something that can be appealed to in that history. Will there be any guarantee that either the United States or North Korea will hold to any future agreement? No, there's never any guarantee of that. It's certainly the case, I would say, with the United States, even more so than North Korea, because remember, we're a democracy, and when we elect a new administration, that administration sometimes comes in and says, hey, we don't like what the previous administration did, and we're going to tear it up. Exhibit A being Donald Trump with the Paris Climate Accord, potentially with the Iran nuclear agreement, certainly with the TPP trade agreement. So there's good reason for folks in Pyongyang to look over at the United States and say, hey, we can't trust you folks, even if you have the best of intentions when you're negotiating, because 4 years later, voters might change their minds, and therefore you change your mind. So those are the problems we always are dealing with in negotiations.
And how do North Korea's human rights abuses factor into negotiations? And in particular, how do North Korea's treatment of Americans, Kenneth Bae and Otto Warmbier, of course, tragically passing away a few months ago, how would that factor into negotiations between the United States and North Korea?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that it goes both ways. In other words, obviously, North Korea's treatment of Kenneth Bae and Otto Warmbier does not help the situation. It creates a certain amount of mistrust and anger on the part of American negotiators. On the other hand, the negotiations that took place to release both of them at least established some kind of back-channel discussions between the United States and North Korea, even at a difficult time. So that's Americans in particular held in North Korea. The issue of human rights more generally, well, yes, North Korea has a terrible human rights situation, generally rated one of the worst in the world, certainly at the level of Eritrea or Sudan. But as is the case with virtually all arms control negotiations, they tend to be unlinked. In other words, the focus is on the arms program and the chief concern of the countries in question. So, for instance, Yes, the Trump administration has complained a great deal about Iran's human rights record, but Iran's human rights record was not part of the nuclear deal. There's nothing in the deal that refers to that. The two sides can certainly continue to have discussions on human rights. Nothing in the agreement precludes those discussions. But in order to achieve any kind of agreement on a difficult question like a nuclear program, it has to focus specifically on the nuclear program without this kind of linkage. I would argue the same thing applies to North Korea. Certainly the United States can continue to lodge complaints about North Korea at the UN and the Human Rights Council. It can even threaten to bring Kim Jong-Un up on crimes against humanity. But that's separate from dealing with North Korea's nuclear program.
If you listen to the news today, it almost seems like I should be preparing to duck and cover because a nuclear strike might occur at any moment. What are the actual odds of there being some sort of catastrophic disaster where the U.S. and North Korea decide to actually engage in war? And what do you think the predictions are going into the future for the relations going forward?
Well, I remember reading recently a prediction by some former general that he put the odds at 10% for a nuclear exchange and 30% for some kind of war in general. I don't know if I would go that far. I would probably put war closer to 10% in general, and a nuclear exchange is very unlikely for one major reason, and that is I don't really think North Korea has the capability or the desire, for that matter, to launch a nuclear attack against anyone, because it knows that it can't predict what would happen if it tried to do so, because its nuclear program is, again, relatively untested, and two, because it knows that launching such an attack would be suicidal. It would precipitate a return exchange that would annihilate the country, basically. The United States is relatively reluctant to go down the nuclear path because it knows that would possibly bring China into the conflict in a way that a more conventional approach, even a conventional military approach, might not bring China into the conflict. And I don't think the United States wants to get into any kind of conflict with China, because that would be an escalation beyond what even the worst case scenarios of a U.S.-North Korean exchange. So that's why I would put nuclear war very, very low, and therefore I don't think you have to worry too much about duck and cover. In terms of war in general, well, again, I don't think either side really wants to go to war, and in fact, neither side is really prepared for war up to this point. Yes, we've heard harsh rhetoric, but the United States has actually not put into position around North Korea the forces necessary to go to war. Plus, Trump is heading to Asia relatively soon, and it would be relatively unusual for the president to launch a war in a place he's about to go to. And North Korea, too, is not really prepared in any way that we've been able to monitor for any kind of military action. So I think at this point, certainly, I would put the risk of war relatively low, with one exception, and that being the risk of accidental conflict, because of course that is how wars sometimes happen, not because either side or any side plans to go to war, but because there has been a miscalculation or even a misinterpretation, and escalation takes on its own logic, and neither side wants to back down, and unfortunately that leads to a situation that neither side wanted, but both sides end up contributing to.
All right, and one final question very quickly before we wrap up here, and that centers around Guam as well as the other American territories in the Pacific, because we heard a lot of talk about Guam potentially being targeted by a North Korean nuclear strike. Now, even if a nuclear strike doesn't occur, and obviously we hope that a nuclear strike does not occur, and even if war doesn't break out, again, we obviously hope war doesn't break out, but the U.S. territory in Guam is still going to exist moving forward. So how does the U.S. having Guam as one of its territories, as well as the other U.S. territories in the Pacific, where do they factor into this situation potentially moving forward?
Well, North Korea threatened not to attack Guam, but to basically test a missile that would land in the waters around Guam. It's an important distinction. Of course, the United States was not happy with that either. I don't think anybody was happy with that, particularly Guam, but it wasn't a threat to attack Guam itself. Now, more recently, of course, North Korea has threatened to attack U.S. homeland, but again, I don't think that these are threats that translate into actual changes on the ground in North Korean military posture. In terms of how Guam fits in, of course, there are U.S. Marines in Guam, a significant military base, a base that is in the process of expansion as the United States, at least during the Obama administration, was beginning to reorient its Pacific posture, taking some Marines out of Okinawa, for instance, and bringing them to Guam. And partly that was a reaction to how folks in Okinawa and to a certain extent in South Korea were reacting to the presence of U.S. troops. And so it was perceived that expanding the presence in Guam would deal with the sensitivities, shall we say, of local populations and the impact of U.S. troops in Japan and South Korea. I think a lot of that is up in the air with the Trump administration. Certainly the Trump administration would like to expand the military, but it's unclear how the Trump administration what it's thinking in terms of what the U.S. force posture in the Pacific will look like and what Guam's role will be. I think a lot of folks are waiting to see how this current conflict between the United States and North Korea plays out, and whether that will have any impact on, for instance, the number of soldiers we have in South Korea, and what kind of military hardware we place in South Korea. So it's hard to say right now the kind of future of what the Obama administration called the Pacific pivot and the role of islands like Guam in that. I think, again, a lot of it depends on how we get out of this particular crisis. And again, my hope is that it will be resolved diplomatically and in relatively short order, even going back to the days of strategic patience in which there were no negotiations during the Obama administration, so in the latter years of the Obama administration. That is an improvement over what we have right now, which is still a kind of cycle of aggressive rhetoric.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. If someone wants to learn more about what we've been discussing in this episode, and if someone wants to follow your work, where would you direct them?
Well, if they want to follow my work, they can go to my website, which is johnfeffer.com. If they want to follow up on North Korean issues more specifically, there are a number of good websites. Certainly, we publish a lot of stuff at Foreign Policy in Focus at fpif.com. There are other specialty websites. I'll throw one out there for folks, 38north.com, which also, you can get a lot of very specific information about what's happening in and around North Korea.
Okay, great. Well, of course, we will link to all of those resources on the show notes page. And again, the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/North-Korea. So that's going to be the place to go for this episode and for related resources and related episodes of this show covering similar topics. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/North-Korea is the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher. And that way you can get all the episodes and receive updates when new episodes are published. And John, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and for joining us to discuss the North Korea issue. It's obviously an issue that's been in the news a lot in recent months. So thank you so much for joining us to take a look at that issue. And as there are new developments, we hope to speak with you again.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast. If you'd like to listen to more episodes, please check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also contact us via our website. And thanks again for listening.